It's a real great pleasure tonight to be hosting these 3 talks. The way that it will work is that each speaker is going to speak for about 20 minutes, a TED-style talk on a different topic. So we hope that it will be enjoyable, meaningful, and diverse as well. And our first speaker this evening, it's really a great pleasure that Yael's agreed to teach here. She was going to be coming to join us at Southampton for a Shabbat, I think about a month ago, that we were really looking forward to in May. And of course, coronavirus changed everybody's plans. So this was the next best thing that we could get for now, but we very much look forward to Yael joining us again in person. And I personally fell in love with Yael's work when I first read the biography she wrote on Nechama Leibowitz, which is just for anybody who hasn't read it or hasn't read it for a while. It's the kind of thing that every now and again, I just go back and reread certain parts of it because it's just a work that not only is so informative and is clearly so much research went into it, but you also see the love and passion of the author behind the work. So I personally am vying that there'll be some kind of a session on the Nechama Leibowitz biography at some point. But for the meantime, Yael, it's a great pleasure to host you. Over to you.
Thank you very much. You can hear me, yeah? The sound is good? Yeah? Okay, great. Okay, so tonight's topic is the topic of empathy. I think it's relevant to this time of year. I think it's relevant to the whole year, but I think it's relevant to this time of year because we want to be talking about the opposite of baseless hatred. We want to be talking about love for our fellow Jew and our fellow human. And I think that empathy has something to do with that. I'll also be bringing at the end a source that's directly relevant to this time of year. So the first thing I want to discuss with you is what is empathy? How do we define it? And how is it different from any similar terms? Now, I don't know if this is supposed to be an interactive talk, but I think that if anybody would like to just maybe write a definition in the chat box, if I ask you what's empathy, what would you write? Let's see if this works. I don't know if it's going to work technically. Somebody want to write a definition? Empathy. Okay. Chat. No one's written anything yet.
Or to unmute. Yeah, is that okay if someone wants to unmute and?
We could try and do that.
There we go. There's something in the chat.
Here we've got a chat. Appreciating the feeling of others from Ben Leon. And from Ben Gross, standing in someone else's shoes. From Deborah Deach, sympathy, but with some knowledge of the situation. Great, good stuff. Okay, so we appreciate the feeling of others. Okay, what does appreciate mean? Does that mean that we don't fully know what it is, but we have some appreciation of it? Standing in someone else's shoes. It's a great expression, right? And the question is, what it actually means. Can you ever stand in someone else's shoes? Other people's shoes don't fit us, okay? And Deborah suggested sympathy, which, you know, I brought the word empathy, and then generally when I give this shiur, somebody mentions sympathy, and the question is, what's the difference between them? And Deborah's suggesting that if you have some knowledge of the situation, it's going to turn more into empathy. And, you know, another question is, what is the difference between sympathy and empathy? Some people feel as if sympathy is a little bit more patronizing, maybe the person, maybe not, that's a negative word, but the person feels more external to the situation, and empathy might be more inside the situation. Words that might come up would be identifying with the person, right? So we've got there's a lot to discuss here. Empathy is a topic that, you know, when you study to be a therapist or these kinds of things, you know, you can really discuss at length. But if I read to you the dictionary definitions, we have empathy is the power of entering another's personality and imaginatively experiencing their experiences. And sympathy is a community of feeling. And again, the power of entering another's feelings or mind, compassion and pity. And those two didn't appear in the empathy definition. And another question is, well, what is empathy in Hebrew? How do we say empathy in Hebrew? Does anyone know? Write in the chat box if you know. Empathy. Okay, so I live in Israel. If we want to say empathy, what do we have to say? We have to say 3, 2, 1. No one. We have to say empatia. There's no word, right? It's just they take the English word, as they often do, and turn it into a Hebrew word. Now, what does that mean? Why is there no word for empathy in Jewish sources that we can draw on? If I asked you, what's the closest word to empathy in Jewish sources? What might you think of? Let's have somebody type something in. What might you think of? Concept in Jewish sources that will be similar to empathy. Anyone got any ideas? Somebody wants to unmute themselves and just say Gila. Lishmoa, to hear, to listen. Okay, that's nice, but that's not the same as empathy. It's a whole different action. Rachem, okay, says David and Barbara Morgan. So rachem, you know, mercy, rachamim, close to compassion. Compassion is chemla. Okay, these words come close, right? But they're not exactly the same. When I was teaching the Bradfield program, someone suggested, Al tadun et chavercha, don't judge your friend until you come to stand in their shoes, which is, you know, hold off on judgment, but it's still not quite the same feeling. Okay, so we don't have the exact concept of empathy coming out of the Jewish sources, but we do see this empathy playing a role, and we learn about it in some sources I brought for you today. And of course, this is just a selection of sources. Okay, so now what I'd like to try and do is to share with you my screen. Let's see how well this goes. Okay, share. There we go. Okay, good. Okay, so I hope that those of you who are watching on a cell phone, I'll make it a little bit bigger. Okay, so we have a first source, which is from Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, a midrash, and the scene is, well, I'm going to let you guess the scene. Let's just read it. And those who brought the bricks up brought them up from the east side, and those who went back down to get more bricks went down from the west side. If a person fell and died, no one cared. But if a brick fell, they would sit and moan and weep and say, woe is to us, when will another come up to replace it? Okay, so I think that you can guess what the scene is here, right? The Tower of Babel, Tower of Babel that they're building. Abraham, son of Terach, passed by and saw them building the city and tower and cursed them in the name of God. This is a fantastic midrash, very dramatic. And the question is, what's happening here? Well, I wish I could have a discussion with you, but it's a little difficult in this format. But what's happening here is clearly that there's a very big problem. Okay, there's a very big problem with these people. And they seem to be valuing a brick over a human life. If we looked at it in terms of empathy, they have zero empathy for the human being. They do not feel the person's feelings. They do not identify with the person at all. That person is lower than a brick, right? And if you think that this is just an ancient concept, right? I have an article here. It's quite an old article about shopper knocked unconscious after being trampled. Here, I'll show you. 1 second. Shopper knocked unconscious after being trampled in a rush. Okay, a bunch of people in Florida were rushing for a sale on DVD players, and they trampled the first woman in line. Okay, so, you know, objects being more important than people, sweatshops around the world, right? Human life being very cheap in various places. I read an article about a Holocaust survivor who was trampled by a man running for a train in Penn Station. Okay, so these things are not just some ancient midrash. And if you look at what Avram was doing, he walks past these he's very violent. He curses them in the name of God. And you know, I was watching a film called Nuremberg from the year 2000. We see Nazis on trial talking to a psychologist who happens to be Jewish, and he's trying to understand how human beings could be so cruel. And at one point he has the revelation that they don't have any empathy for their victims. They didn't see the victims as being human, as being sentient beings like themselves. And so this phrase, lack of empathy is the root of all evil, shows us that what Avram's doing as he walks past is he's saying, this is not who I want to be. I separate myself from this. Abraham is starting ethical monotheism. And he curses them in the name of God to show that the ethical and the monotheistic come together. But what's at the root of their behavior is a clear lack of empathy, okay? And that's why we have to bear in mind that empathy is actually extremely important and fundamental. Daniel Goleman in Emotional Intelligence points out that it's one of the first things to develop in babies. They feel bad for other babies crying. Okay, so it's a very important human trait. Okay, and the I thou of Buber, to see the other person as a thou. So that's the first source. And now I'm going to move on to the second one, sharing the screen again. Okay. So our second source is from the Gemara, from Psachim, right? And this is very interesting. It's about the prophet Hosea. Now listen to this. It's actually quite humorous in a terrible kind of way. Hashem said to Hosea, your sons have sinned. Okay, pregnant pause. What's Hosea going to respond? Hosea should have replied, oh, they are your sons, the sons of the ones you love, the sons of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Have mercy on them. Not only did he not say this, he actually said, Master of the universe, the whole world is yours. Exchange them for another nation, right? Why are you putting up with these Israelites? They're terrible. Go get another one, right? Bring in a receipt and ask for another one. The Holy One, blessed be he, said, what shall I do to this old man? I will tell him, go take a prostitute and have sons of promiscuity with her. And after that, I'll tell him, send her away from you. If he's able to, then I will also send Israel. Okay, now what's interesting here, so the prophet Hosea, we see that in the book of Hosea, he's told by God to do this very strange thing, which is to go and marry a prostitute and have children with her. And what the Gemara is coming along and saying is, God wants to educate Hosea, who is failing prophecy 101. The prophet is supposed to be the intermediary between God and the Jewish people. And he's not doing his job here. He's supposed to be defending the Jewish people against God's ire. And instead he's like, oh, go get another one. It's really quite funny. And so God says, I've got to teach him a lesson. But instead of talking to him and educating him, he decides that he needs to go through a process. And he's going to make him go through a very deep emotional process by marrying this woman and becoming connected to her even when she betrays him. And that shows that you have to experience something in order to really empathize. Hosea was not showing any empathy with God's love for Israel. He wasn't feeling it. And in order for him to feel it really deeply in his body, he needed to go through an experience. And that touches on the question of how empathetic can we be with people if we haven't been through the same experience? If my friend's house has been, God forbid, robbed and mine hasn't, you know, do I really know what that feels like? I mean, this is why people have support groups of the same kind of people, you know, parents of children who won't stop eating bananas or whatever it is, right? And but then on the other hand, if you've had similar experiences, maybe you can, you know, project into that and still have empathy. But this prophet needed to go through something very similar in order to learn his lesson. I think it's a fantastic source. Now, the third source, I don't want to spend too much time on, but it is also, I think, quite enlightening in a certain way. So let's just have a look. So I'm just going to very quickly read it and point out what's going on. This is about Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, who suffered with medical problems for much of his life. The sufferings of Rebbe, that's Rabbi Yehuda, Judah the prince, okay, the one who redacted the Mishnah, wrote down the Mishnah. He came to him through a certain incident and they departed likewise. What incident did his sufferings come to him from? A calf was being taken to the slaughter, and when it broke away, it hid its head under Rebbe's skirts, right, under his garment, and it lowed in terror, it bellowed in terror. Go, said he, for this you were created. Okay, quite a hard-hearted response. Thereupon they said in heaven, since he has no pity, let us bring suffering upon him, in order to create pity in Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, right? Even for this little calf, he should have had pity. God sent these awful medical conditions and suffering to Rebbe to soften his heart. And then many years later, departed likewise. One day his maidservant was sweeping the house. She saw some young weasels lying there. So I don't know why there were weasels in the house, but anyway, she made to sweep them away. Let them be, said he to her. It is written, and his tender mercies are over all his works. And that's Rebbe. So Rebbe's learned his lesson. He's changed, said they in heaven. Since he's compassionate, let us be compassionate to him. Okay, so again, this isn't, you know, this is compassion. This is pity, very close to empathy. This time it's for animals, and we can have empathy for animals as well. We can feel maybe a bit of what they're feeling. Obviously, it's very hard to get into the world of an animal, but the concept is is similar. And through these little animals, he learned his lesson. This was one of the top Jew, you know, great man. And he, despite his greatness, his heart was too hard, and a Jew is supposed to have a soft heart. Now, this brings me to my final source, which is actually one that is really relevant to today. And I want to spend a little bit of time on it. So have a look and get ready to be a little bit surprised, okay? If you haven't been till now, okay? And it goes like this. So this source is from Sanhedrin, the Talmud in Sanhedrin. And it's based on the word balayla, which is from Megillat Eicha, Lamentations, which we're going to read in 3 weeks' time, God willing, on Tisha B'Av, unless Mashiach makes it first, which I hope he does. Anyway, and that's interesting. Where did that come from? And basically, this balayla, it is, you know, she weeps at night. We're talking about the city that weeps at night. And what they do with this is something new. So they say another meaning, at night, whoever weeps at night, those who hear weep too. There's something about weeping at night that causes anyone who hears it to also cry. I don't know if any of you have ever just been sitting around and heard somebody crying at night. I have, and I was walking past a building. It was very disconcerting. Okay, so there was once a woman, a neighbor of Rabban Gamliel's, whose son had died, and she would weep over him at night. When Rabban Gamliel heard her voice, he wept opposite her until his eyelashes fell out. The next day, his students noticed this and removed her from his neighborhood. Yes, you heard right. I'm going to repeat those last words again. They noticed this, that his eyelashes fell out, and so they removed the woman from the neighborhood. Now, I'm assuming that you are as shocked as I was the first time I read this. You know, like, really? They took away the woman? Like, she hadn't suffered enough? They carted her away from her apartment, and, you know, it's mind-boggling, actually. It's very, very hard to understand. So we have to unpack it and try to understand what was going on. There are a few questions here. You know, Rabban Gamliel, he's crying. Why is he crying so much? You know, and you know, and the students, if Rabban Gamliel is so sensitive and amazing, how come he wasn't able to teach his students to even have the tiniest bit of sensitivity, not to think about carting this woman away from the neighborhood? What's going on in this source? Why is the Gemara brought a source that puts these students in such a bad light, and then it stops there? It doesn't even explain. It doesn't say the students were punished. It doesn't say the woman sued them, and nothing. We don't, like, that's it. So without a lot of time to spare here, I want to show you something again, which is this kind of triangle that I want to create, which is between Rabban Gamliel, the students, and the woman. And the question is, who's showing empathy to who, and who's not showing empathy to who? So if I could hear you speak, I imagine that you would say, well, Rabban Gamliel's showing empathy to the woman, right? And the students are definitely not showing empathy to the woman. So there'd be like, right, a cross. There would not be a connection between them. And the students are showing empathy to Rabban Gamliel. That's what it seems to us if we look through the lens of empathy. I want to argue that there's something else going on here which teaches us something about empathy and its limits and how it works. And that the key lies in the following phrase, until his eyelashes fell out. It's a very odd phrase. And I don't know if any of you can guess where else it appears, I think, one other time in the Tanakh, okay? So where would that be? And that is in the case of Leah. Do you remember that she had these soft eyes? Einei Leah Rakot, she's described as having these soft eyes. And what we hear is that she cried very, very much because she was told she would have to marry Esau. She cried till her eyelashes fell out. That's what I think the Gemara or the Midrash says. And I just thought to myself, wow, that's really extreme. I mean, this is the crying of somebody who cries feeling very, very helpless and like as if the fate is conspiring against her. In the end, she doesn't have to, but you know, that's how she's feeling. This kind of ongoing weeping that's really extreme and beyond all limits. And I thought, Rabban Gamliel, he's not just crying because he's upset that his female neighbor is, you know, is bereaved. there's something going on here. And what I want to suggest is that Rabban Gamliel, he was the leader of the generation, okay? And he actually lived through the destruction of the temple. And I want to suggest that every time this woman cried, what was happening was he was reliving that trauma, the collective trauma of the destruction of the temple. That was what he felt. He felt upset, right? That it was nothing that they could do. It was a horrible trauma that we can barely imagine. I don't even want to start us imagining that. So what I want to suggest is that the woman was essentially triggering Rabban Gamliel to this extreme crying of helplessness. He wasn't really seeing her. I mean, I wasn't there, but you know, it's a reading. He wasn't seeing her. It just brought him straight back into that place where he just couldn't believe what had happened to Am Yisrael. And that's why he was crying so much. And that's why, essentially, he wasn't really being empathetic, right? I think Rabban Gamliel was quite a tough character. And he was, well, maybe not. I don't know enough about him. But that's why he wasn't able to teach his students about empathy, because he wasn't really being necessarily empathetic himself. He was being triggered. And that raises another topic around empathy, which is when somebody else is upset, right? And we start to cry ourselves because we've been triggered. That's not really empathy. That's actually just, you know, we've been thrown into our own place, and actually we can't really help the person if we dissolve ourselves. And that's why therapists are taught to keep all that together and keep some kind of separation between themselves and the person. And so what we see here is, what we've seen is that empathy is something that's really important. It's foundational. We start to develop it as babies. But as we go through our lives, we have to learn how to use it, and we have to learn how to feel what the other person's feeling, as Hoshea had to learn, but also to separate ourselves from that. And here we also have Rabban Gamliel, who's very, very upset about the Bet HaMikdash. And in a way, during these 3 weeks of mourning now, we have to put ourselves in a position where, even though the Bet HaMikdash, the temple, was so many years ago, we have to try to feel those feelings of the people who went through that. So we have to do a kind of a really open our empathy spigot there and feel, you know, imaginatively feel that, and kind of join Rabban Gamliel there. So with this, I basically end. I want to invite everybody who wants to Google afterwards and have a look at this poem, which is by Nobel Prize-winning author, Polish author Wisława Szymborska. It's called Under One Small Star, and there are some lines here with this kind of weird, extreme empathy that are definitely worth looking at and asking yourself, what is she saying? Is it ironic? And you know, do we want to ever aim for that kind of empathy, or is that just way beyond the bounds? So I'll stop here. We managed to touch on something, and I hope it was interesting for you. It's very hard for me. I wasn't able to talk to you, but I hope that you enjoyed it and took something from it. And I'll hand the baton over to the next speaker. So thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Yael. I don't want to take any more time up from the 20 minutes that are coming up. I don't think Rabbi Gideon needs that much of an introduction. We miss our Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur that we've been enjoying together in the past. It's a treat to have you at least virtually connect with us. And also I specifically very much treasure that, gosh, must be about 14 years ago now. I was doing a fellowship in Jerusalem, and they said, we've got a very special philosophy teacher who's going to be coming in. He's English. And it was Rabbi Gideon. And actually from that one course, there's so much that I really still think about and grapple with on a day-to-day basis. So I'm excited. Thank you very much, Rabbi Gideon.
Great, fantastic. So first of all, really, really, really lovely to be back with Southampton. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I am thrilled to be with you all. I'm also thrilled to see lots of old friends up on the screen, and I can see friends from Helsinki and from Southampton and from Israel and from America, and it's really, really lovely to see you all. You'll have to excuse me, I am a little bit wiped. My mum had a fall the other day on Tuesday, and I've been kind of living in Sharet Tzedek Hospital since. So I'm speaking to you from Sharet Tzedek Hospital, which is an absolutely amazing place and a very inspiring place and a place of incredible kindness and love. But I haven't had much sleep for the last 3 days, so I'm a bit not with it. But we're going to press on, and I hope it'll be interesting. And we're going to focus on two things which are really, which have kind of bugged me for a few years. two kind of issues that have bugged me. Issue number one is in Israel, every single year at around this time of year, there's a battle to be fought where someone writes an article in the newspapers. Sometimes it's Rabbi Cardozo saying the time has come, and there are kind of variations on a theme, so I don't want to put something onto him, but we should be abolishing the fasts. We shouldn't be fasting. They're no longer relevant because we're living in a modern state of Israel. And I usually engage in a battle over them because I'm kind of quite a fan of these fasts, even though I hate them. I think that they're incredibly raw and meaningful. And so I want to look at why I don't think they should be abolished. And the second little kind of anecdote which goes together with that is that on the March of the Living, which I have the privilege of guiding when there isn't Corona, there's a very strange tradition. We spend a week looking around Poland and visiting all these incredibly emotional and disturbing and upsetting sites. And then all the Jews are brought to Auschwitz, where they stand in a queue for about 4 hours, waiting for the March of the Living to start. Everyone behaves incredibly calmly, even though they've been pumped with this story of Jewish persecution. There's no rioting, no bricks go through windows, and it's really quite extraordinary that people behave so incredibly well. And then things get even stranger because there's a tradition among the teenagers that they swap badges and they swap caps and hats, and they all have little bits of memorabilia from their country's March of the Living, and they swap and they sing and they dance, and we're in the deepest, darkest place of hell, the place of some of the greatest suffering there's ever been, and there they all are celebrating. And the first year I saw it, I was shocked and very upset by it, and then I thought more about it. And I'd like to kind of explore a little bit about why I think it has a meaningfulness to it. I'd love to do this by giving you a share and sharing a screen. We see if I can do this. Kotel on Tisha B'Av. Go. Does that work? Can you see the sources? Someone raise the thumb if you can see them. Yay, hooray. Okay, good. So I'm afraid they're all a bit in Hebrew. I've been living in topsy-turvy land for the last 3 days, and I didn't have a chance to translate most of them. But I decided, if you're frummy enough to be here on the fast of Tammaz at this unearthly hour, then you'd manage somehow. And our first source comes from the Shulchan Aruch, and it's a source that talks about not going for walks on Tisha B'Av. On Tisha B'Av, there's not much to do once you've exhausted saying the prayers, which are pretty incomprehensible. And the Shulchan Aruch says, Yesh mi shomer, there's someone who says, Shelo yelech v'tayel b'shuk, that one shouldn't go for walks in the marketplace, Kedei shelo yavo lidei schok, so you won't come to kind of laugh and enjoy and joke with your friends for kalut rosh and lightheadedness. Yesh mi shomer shelo, oh sorry, it printed it twice, my apologies. So the Shulchan Aruch is against us going for walks on Tisha B'Av, because he says we're going to lose the atmosphere of what it should be like. It's supposed to be a super heavy day in which you kind of stay at home. It's kind of locked down, or you're either in shul or you're at home. It's kind of locked down Tisha B'Av style. And the Ramah, Rabbi Moses Islis, who lived in Krakow, the great Ashkenazi halachic authority, goes even worse. If you look at the second line of his, the first he's talking about getting ready for after the fast. So he says that one shouldn't start shechting animals till the afternoon, because at least in the morning, you should be heavily engaged in the fast. And then he says, can you see in the second line where it says Haggah, which is the key that we're going to be learning, the Ramah, and he says, Volchim al hakvarot miyad shekol mishecholchim mibet knesset. He says, as soon as you leave shul, the tradition that we have here in Krakow is that we all go to the graveyard. I guess anyone who's been to Krakow will know that this makes a lot of sense for the Ramah to say this. I'd never thought of this before, but those of you who've been to the Ramah's synagogue in Krakow, right on the campus of the synagogue is the graveyard where the Ramah and his family and many of the greatest of the great of rabbinic literature are buried. Also buried there, for those of you who are Shlomo Carlebach fans, the Holy Miser is buried at the back of the cemetery, and that's a famous Carlebach story. If you're in the mood, you can Google the story, and you'll hear him tell it. So it makes sense that the Ramah would say we go to the graveyard after shul because it's next door. But we're going to see that the Mishnah Berurah, the Chofetz Chaim, was very, very frum about this. And the Mishnah Berurah says, "Katav hashla shenachon shelo lelech b'kanufya gedola." Don't go in big groups to the graveyard. He ends there elatiul, because if you go with all your mates to the graveyard, even though it's Tisha B'Av, even though it's the graveyard, even though you would think that it's all going to be very serious, the fact is that once you're there with all your friends, it could all lose the atmosphere of Tisha B'Av. And therefore he says, "V'gam mevi lidei sichat chulin," it'll lead you to kind of unnecessary, meaningless chatter, and you'll forget that you're supposed to be mourning. And so he says you should just go to the graveyard on your own and very quietly and very thoughtfully be there. So we have this idea that Tisha B'Av is a day where we're supposed to be intent on the morning and going out of the house. You can go just about to the graveyard, but even there, you're supposed to make sure you're pretty miserable. And then we have in source 4, we won't read it, A, because I think time is short. I think I've only got a few minutes left. And B, can someone tell me how much longer I have? Like 5 minutes, I think. Is that right? I don't know. Okay. Someone hold up a hand with how many minutes? Okay, I'll just keep talking until someone stops me. We have Rav Eliezer, someone's going to stop me soon. We have Rabbi Eliezer Melamed, and he has this very beautiful comment, which I came across for the first time this year. You remember Rabbi Eliezer Melamed, those of you who were in South Hampstead for Shabbat Shuvah a couple of years ago, we learned his ideas about wearing what type of shoes you could wear on Tisha B'Av, because he's this incredibly modern posek who's always interested in modern questions. The other day I learned him discussing whether you could pray from an iPhone or not, and under what conditions you can. So here he talks about whether you can walk to the Kotel on Tisha B'Av. And he says, my dad always taught us that absolutely you can go to the Kotel on Tisha B'Av. And he says, even though anyone who's ever been to the Kotel on Tisha B'Av knows that it's a huge social and you're bound to see loads of friends, he says, nonetheless, you should go. And he says, and we don't stop you, in the same way that there's a halacha which says that during the 9 days, even though we don't do cheery building, build houses that are going to be for pleasure, you can build the temple. And in the same way as you can build the temple during this week, you can also go to the Kotel. And Rav Chaim David Halevi, who was the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, and therefore has a tshuva, which I probably mentioned to some of you in the past, but I love it very, very much, because it's so incredibly honest. And you can read it for yourselves on the source sheet later on, but there probably isn't time now, where he describes what it was like for him the first time he went to the Kotel on Tisha B'Av. And he went there to kind of increase his mourning and to think about how awful Tisha B'Av is. And he got there and he saw all these kids there and he saw these families and he saw the joy and he felt amazing about it. And he made various adaptations in the tefillot as a result of that. And what I think the rabbis are saying with all of this, and what I think they're saying with the tradition that the Mashiach, that the Messiah is born on Tisha B'Av, is that somehow in the sadness, in the terrible depths of the gloom of Tisha B'Av, there's also that little inkling of hope. And that little inkling of hope is not something we should dismiss. It's something we should hold onto and treasure. And therefore, even though you can't go to the graveyard, you can go to the Kotel. And when you go to the Kotel, you don't just have to think sad thoughts. You can hold on to that moment of joy. And you can hold on, I think, to that incredible idea that the Nevi'im talk about, that one day your sad days will be transformed into days of simcha, days of joy and days of rejoicing. I suspect, and it's a huge thing to say, but I suspect that what I've witnessed in Auschwitz on the March of the Living is incredibly, unbelievably, extraordinarily a little bit of that process, that the worst place in the world, the saddest, most deathliest place in the whole of the planet, suddenly is being transformed into a place of simcha. To me, it's jarring, but there's also something beautiful. And the same of Tisha B'Av, it has deep sadness. And I think we should hold on to that sadness. I don't want it abolished. I think there are things that are still wrong in Israel, things that we haven't yet got quite right, things that we need to work on, and to pretend that we're in messianic times and it's all sorted and hunky-dory, I think would be a phenomenal mistake in every way. But to recognize that we have the seeds of something stunningly beautiful, to walk around a Jewish hospital where at the end of the fast, everyone goes up on the roof, overlooks Jerusalem, says their prayers, comes inside, and people have laid out a great spread of food for everyone to be able to break their fast. It's an incredibly beautiful luxury of our generation. So I think on Tisha B'Av, we hold on to the morning, but we also get, at least here, a glimpse of future redemption and a glimpse of future simcha. And please God, it should be speedily in our days. And please God, we should first of all get redemption from the awful plague that's hurting us so much wherever we are in the world. I wish you all an easy end of the fast. That must be time up, right?
Refuah shlema for your mother, Gideon.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you.
And how amazing that you're even doing this from the hospital.
It's amazing you can hear me because the internet here isn't brilliant always.
I was trying to shout out in the middle and say, just take your time. You don't need to rush. But thank you for the timekeeping. Perhaps you can put a link for put the last source in the chat or something so that people can read it in their own time afterwards if they haven't had a
Okay,
second.
brilliant. Thank you very much.
Okay, I wanted to, I know I'm very aware that I have the graveyard slot, as everybody's getting tired after 2 practice and talks. So I wanted to address something a little lighter. Sorry. A little bit lighter, and also something that I think is very topical on as a national fast day at any time that's sort of a national time of introspection, thinking about what I think is perhaps one of the greatest challenges we face today, actually as a whole civilization, and that is the relevance of prayer today. You know, even if we look at just how practiced prayer was 1 generation ago globally to what it is today, it's so dramatically different. You know, if I look within our own community, I mean, certainly if we looked at 90%, I would say, of our 18 to 30-year-olds on Yom Kippur, they don't access the full prayer service. They'll come, they'll pack out for the Yom Kippur debate, and some of them we might see at Ne'ilah, but very few are we actually seeing accessing, you know, formal prayer. I think that throws up a tremendous challenge to us as a community and a world to really go away and rethink the nature of prayer. So obviously this is a humongous topic, and we have about 10 minutes. So it just really gives us the opportunity to scratch the surface. But I wanted to almost open a conversation perhaps, and it could be that we'll be left with more questions than we have answers, but at least that will be food for thought. I want to address 3 critical issues that I think are sort of at the heart of looking at prayer. And the first of those is what the nature of prayer is. So is prayer about having a formal, universal, uniform ritual, that there's something epic that from one generation to the next, everybody is saying the same prayers, accessing those same words, and wherever you go around the world, everybody's using that same siddur? but it's ritual, it's set. I'm not saying just what I feel like offering today. Or is it the other extreme, which is prayer the outpouring of the heart? Is it actually communicating with God and saying what I feel? And I think that dichotomy, perhaps it's even worth throwing it out there just to check that people are not sleeping yet. I mean, what do you think? Well, how should we relate to prayer? Or how perhaps do we in practice, do our shuls and our schools that are teaching prayer relate to prayer? Is the emphasis on accessing ritual, or is there emphasis on connecting and an outpouring of the soul? Anyone? Feel free to unmute. Someone show me that you're not asleep. Yeah, Ruth.
I've forgotten what the question was. Why can't it be both? Why can't both aspects come into the experience? Because we can't, well, I can't maintain either for a very long, but I can maintain both for in and out.
Yeah, fascinating. And I think that's exactly what we see, both in the Tanakh and in the Talmud. We see this kind of dichotomy of the oscillation of both of these things. So if we look at the Tanakh, most of the famous prayers that we know, most of the stories of prayer are individuals who are pouring their hearts out. Like the prophet Jeremiah said, Shifri kamayim libech, pour your heart out like water before God. And if we think of the prayer scenarios, those famous prayers of, you know, Eliezer praying that he's going to find the right wife for Yitzchak, or Moshe praying that that Miriam will be healed from her tzara'at, or Hannah praying that she's going to have a baby. All of those things, they're a spontaneous connection. It's spontaneously turning to God, whether it's in elation or grief, anxiety, anger, whatever the feeling is, it's about sharing that, feeling a sense of connection that I want to open up that conversation. And that is really, when we look at most prayer in the Tanakh, that's what it is. However, when we look at blessings in the Tanakh, what we see is that when Moses came to bless the people at the end of his life in V'zot HaBracha, the final parsha of the Torah, he was the greatest prophet who ever lived. He knew the people so well, was so connected to them. He could have started and given a very, very heartfelt, personal blessing to each one. He didn't do that. He went back to the blessing that Jacob had given his 12 sons sitting around his bed before he passed away in Parshat Vayechi. He took that template and he tweaked it a little bit. He shifted the balance somewhat. He personalized it. He Mosesified it, so to speak. But he went with a set, ready template. And we see the same thing of his successor with Yeshua. Before Yeshua's passing, again, he had led the people through unique times, going into the land of Israel from the desert. He didn't come up with a creative novel speech, but he took that same template and once again tweaked it. And so when we put those two halves together, it would seem that we're almost being pointed in both directions. And it's the same thing in the very famous discussion in the Talmud, in Masechet Brachot. It speaks about what are the origins of prayer on Daf Chafvav 26. The services that we have today of Shacharit, Mincha, and Marav, praying 3 times a day, where did they originate from? And 2 opinions are put forward. The one is Keneged Avot Tiknum. They were put forward in parallel to the 3 patriarchs. We see that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob each prayed. And so the sages say Abraham prayed the first Shacharit. Isaac, when he went to wander in the fields before he met Rivka, that was the first Mincha. And when Jacob was running away from Esau, that was the first Marav. And so they say that's where we got the 3 services from. But then another opinion is brought. And that is, it's not in parallel to the patriarchs, but rather it's in parallel to the offerings that were brought in the temple. Keneged korbanot tiknum. What's the difference? Because at the end of the day, we still come out with 3 prayer services. So what does it matter whether it's parallel to the sacrifices or parallel to the patriarchs? think it comes down to precisely this same point, which is if we imagine Abraham standing in prayer, or Isaac wandering in the fields, Jacob scared and all alone, that's the feeling of that spontaneous calling out. When we think of the offerings in the temple, we're thinking of ritual, something that's consistent, that's day in and that's day out. And ultimately in the Talmud over there, there isn't a particular conclusion given, both are incorporated. So it does seem, as Ruth said, to be exactly that. You know, it's interesting that, in fact, you even, well, perhaps there's a fascinating discussion and debate that takes place in the continuation of the Talmud with a fight that actually almost split the Jewish community of the time, which was between Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yeshua, which we don't have time to go into now, but essentially it comes down to this same sort of schism between these two paths. And when you see them reconcile, it's almost a way of saying we need both. But I think that ultimately, you know, in some ways, we're very much creatures of habit. We've done a little exercise at home. We have a kind of family tradition that at the end of prayer, we do a private tefillah. All of us. But what I've noticed over time is that that private tefillah stayed the same. The idea of the private tefillah was kind of end off that prayer with a feeling of, what am I really thinking about now? What do I really spontaneously want to, just in whatever language I want, in whichever words come to my mind, what do I want to say? And yet what's so interesting is how actually that came at a time that one had the time to think and to process. And then actually we often get stuck in these, you know, in the paradigm. So even the spontaneous often becomes ritual. I think that the reason that it's relevant is because this is the balance that's so hard to find. And it taps into two critical things I think we're seeing in society at the moment. The one is the pace of our society, which is, you know, fast and quick, and we're able to be in so many places at once. And I'd say that this whole era where Zoom and tefillah and not having been going to shul has perhaps also challenged the way we see prayer. And tefillah often has its own pace that doesn't necessarily jive with our fast pace of our society. And so when we get stuck in a ritual, or that we don't have time to think about the spontaneous, we're caught somewhere in between those. I think the other reason that it's relevant is because there are so many people who are such spiritual seekers, and they're engaged in meditation, mindfulness, traveling around the world to find something. And we have to ask ourselves as a community, well, why are our prayer services not necessarily doing it for them? Or have we, or in our schools, is the emphasis on the ritual and not on the spontaneous? But then, of course, the danger of the spontaneous is that the minute we don't feel like it, then suddenly we've lost it. So I think that this is something that is significant to be at the forefront of, you know, to my mind, all educators today that are teaching prayer and rabbinic leadership as something that there isn't one set answer to, but it's about creative thinking to constantly be grappling with it and finding new ways to find the balance between those two. The second issue that I wanted to address is really the transformative nature of prayer. I think that, you know, often we find ourselves that we go into prayer and we come out of prayer. And when we look, we scratch the surface a little bit deeper. There's a question which is, what happens with our prayer? On a mystical level, Rav Kook, he took that piece of Talmud, which spoke about how each prayer service was instituted in parallel to one of the patriarchs. And he tried to show how this isn't just about grabbing a shacharit and grabbing a mincha, but rather that prayer is supposed to be a process. You don't just enter in and leave and feel great, but it's something that's much slower. As I said, it's got its own pace and it builds. So he says, when Abraham came to pray, it was referred to as Amidah, standing. That's the beginning of a process. You stand before God and you start something. The description of Yitzchak's prayer was a sicha. He went out, lasuach basadeh. That's a deeper conversation, which he says is mirrored by the time of day. The sun is setting, things are deeper. It's the opportunity to actually now get oneself into it. And then comes Mariv, which he very interestingly says that Marav is described as pigi'ah, happening upon it. And he says some people don't actually reach that level in prayer. We may sometimes, but we won't always. And it could be for that reason that in the Talmud there was the debate about whether Marav was optional, because he said because some people are just not going to get to that level. But what I find so fascinating about the way that he draws it out is that instead of each prayer just standing on their own, he's actually drawing our attention to the fact that prayer is a journey. It's something that we go with through our day, through our life. It builds up. And we need to be able to actually find that natural pace of prayer and appreciate that natural pace of prayer. And I think that that is challenging in today's world often, when so much can be going on at once. You see a similar thing in terms of appreciating the transformative nature of prayer, just very briefly, from Rav Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the Balatanya, when he speaks about the fact that we have these two inclinations, right? The Yetzer Tov, the Yetzer Hara, what he actually calls the godly soul and the animal soul. And that the incredible transformative nature of prayer is that what one can actually achieve in prayer, again, it's a very mystical approach, is that at the time that one prays, the animal soul is almost locked up and put at bay, so that one has just a small window where they actually have the opportunity to prevail over all those difficulties, over all those inclinations. And that's not just something that has to stop when one walks out the shul, but actually can journey with them even for the time after prayer. And that's how powerful he considers the prayer services, that it's actually something that continues even after we've left the prayer service itself. One final piece to this second question about what we're actually achieving in prayer, and that really has come to my attention from a fascinating passage in Ezra in the 10th chapter. So you see how Ezra has brought the people back to build the second temple. And it's all done, and there's been great celebration, everybody's happy, and he suddenly looks around and he cannot even find enough Kohanim to serve in the temple because there's so much assimilation. And so he goes into the corner and he starts to pray and to do vidoy, the confessional prayers, and he's crying, and if all the people are watching, and he's just gone off in seclusion to this prayer. And eventually a man by the name of Shachania comes to him, and he recognizes what a powerful prayer it was and how everybody's been standing around. And he says to him two words, Chazak ve'aseh, be strong and do. Which is really interesting because generally we normally say chazak chazak v'nitchazek, for example, or like the words of Moses to Joshua and God to Joshua, chazak v'ematz, be strong, have courage. But this is different. He's saying be strong, take the strength that you've found through your prayer, but don't leave it here. It's not enough to just have the feeling you came out with, that feel-good factor of, oh, that was a good prayer, but rather you have to have some kind of a follow-up. It has to be followed by human implementation. So whereas we see that Rav Kook and the Balatanya are speaking about how prayer itself can transform us, this passage from Ezra actually challenged us to say prayer alone is not enough if you just leave it when you close that siddur, but it has to make you want to actually go and leave that place and make a change, go and implement something, give you the courage, give you the energy, the inspiration to say, okay, now I can actually go chazak v'aseh, go and do something. And I think that the more that we can explore the nature of prayer, the transformative nature of prayer, and appreciate that, perhaps that ties into our discussion about its relevance in today's society and the way that we educate about prayer. And the third issue that I'd very briefly like to touch upon is the name we give to prayer. And I think that this is particularly pertinent, especially as we're going into these the 3 weeks now. And that is that, of course, we call prayer tefillah. But when you look in the Tanakh, very rarely is prayer called tefillah. In fact, most of the time, there's many different words to describe prayer, whether it's a song or a supplication or a shouting out, but only rarely do we have a description of, and Moses prayed. In fact, one was just last week in Parashat Chokat. And on each occasion that we see this particular phraseology used of, and he prayed for, with V'hit Palel, and he prayed for, it's generally in a particular scenario where somebody has wronged someone else and they ask them to pray for them. So for example, when Avimelech, in the story of Abraham, when Abraham, because of the famine, they left the land of Canaan, and Avimelech took Sarah into the palace, and then he realized what he's done. He comes back to Abraham and he says to him, please go and pray for me, using this word of tefillah. And Abraham went and prayed for him. So too in Parashat Chukat last week, when the people, they've rebelled many times against God, but the difference last week was it says they spoke badly about God and about Moses. They were rebelling directly against Moses. And after that, when they got attacked by snakes, they came to him and they said, we've done wrong. Please pray for us, using this word of tefillah. And it says, and Moses went and prayed for them. And when we draw these, there are a couple of other examples we won't go into now, but what we really see is in order to, in those scenarios, go and pray for that other person, Moses had to have found that in his heart, to have totally forgiven them, and then go and pray for them. And I just think, isn't it astounding that the word we use today for prayer, for all our prayer services, is tefillah, which the very notion of it is that it's not just about me and God, but that I enter into that tefillah having thought about the world around me and the people I interact with. And not even just about those that I love and naturally want to pray for and that are nearest to me, but actually all the more so about those that I don't necessarily love, that before I can step into that prayer, first actually I need to look outwards and think about those around me. Can I truly forgive everybody and even go and pray for them? And then I can enter into what we call tefillah. So then when we look at the origins of it, I think that really challenges our view of it. And so looking at these three issues, the first being the significance of that balance between tapping into a ritual where we're unified with people around the globe, but also with those that have come before us and those that come after us, but still managing to put our own voice into that, find our relevance and share how we can find that relevance, which I think is the ongoing conversation, especially with young people today. The second is how we can not just feel that we're running in and running out and kind of, being yikes and having done it, but that we can tap in the transcendental nature of prayer, but leave it with a resolve to also go and be activists and do. And thirdly, to realize that prayer is not just about my connection with HaKadosh Baruch Hu and with, divinity, but rather before I can actually enter that, I have that responsibility to look around me, because that's the essence of the word tefillah. So I hope that in this time of these 3 weeks, we'll have many opportunities to pray, whether it's to come together virtually and of course in our shul as well. And this Shabbat's the first Shabbat that there'll be prayer taking place back in our shul, please God, all being well. But also that these 3 weeks give us the opportunity to connect as a people and as a civilization, and to come together with great unity. Thank you all so much for joining tonight.